This might come as a surprise to some of you, but despite my love for all things Pokemon, especially the competitive side, I've never actually been to a live event. Being in school means that my schedule is pretty limited, and being in Texas means that we haven't had a major VGC event since 2020 with the Dallas Regionals. Don't get me wrong, I love playing online tournaments, but something about always being online made me feel like I was missing out on the social aspect of the game. But this year, that all changed when I registered to enter the 2023 North American International Championships for my first ever live event. Here's how it went. With my plan to attend NAIC set in my head, there were three major roadblocks I would need to overcome: registration, travel arrangements, and building a team. Now you might think that registration for one of these events is easy, but that couldn't be further from the truth. You see, registration opens in waves, and there are thousands of people competing for each spot the second the wave opens. After camping at my laptop until 8 AM on the first day of registration, and a minor heart attack when the page momentarily crashed, I was all set to pay and throw my hat into the ring. The next step was to find out how I was going to get there and where I was going to stay. Unfortunately, only being 19 at the time meant that I couldn't rent a car, but I actually go to school in Ohio, and I am more than capable of using my connections. My college roommate and local Ohio man, Scott, very graciously allowed me to stay with him and bum a ride to Columbus from Athens. With travel and registration out of the way, now we get to the fun part. At this point, I have plenty of time until it's time to lock in and ship out to Ohio, but I still wanted to make sure that I have my team locked in early to hopefully make up for the massive skill difference between me and my potential opponents. I knew that right from the get-go that I wanted to use my favorite archetype at my first event, and my favorite archetype for Regulation C is none other than the aptly named Dondozo, a core that features both Glimmora and Dondozo. The whole idea with this core is that you can set up toxic spikes with Glimmora and then play the War of Attrition with Dondozo or the other members, which is something I did to land a first place finish in Palkia Academy House Tour number 11 with Wo Chien. I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted Dondozo to be able to do. I wanted to make sure that Dondozo had all it needed to stand up to its biggest bully, Amoonguss. Things like Terra Steel, Terra Grass, and Blumberry were all viable options for this. Tatsugiri is a solid Choice Scarf user, and I trained my Glimmora to be extremely bulky, unlike the last time I used it. While this might sound like a good game plan, I couldn't quite lock in my tools until I knew what the remaining three members of the team would be. Being familiar with this archetype, it should be pretty easy for me to figure out what goes in those last three slots, right? It was not easy to figure out what goes in those last three slots. In fact, I don't think I've ever felt worse about my ability to build teams up until this point. For weeks, Lim, my partner in crime for this event, and I tested so many different filler cores, with our favorite being a bunch of three very strong special attackers. Chi-Yu, Iron Bundle, and Fluttermane were able to take advantage of the poison chip and take quick KOs so that Dondozo could clean, but a new archetype had a nearly perfect counter lead into us no matter what we did. This core was all about being able to take quick KOs, but this wasn't exactly guaranteed against the new balance team that was rising in popularity. Oh, and defensive plays? With these guys? Yeah, forget about it. The team felt extremely capped no matter what we did, and we were both considering jumping ship from Dondozo, until I randomly decided to go through our backlog of team drafts and found something that we had long forgotten about. Let's take a small step back. When I was playing on the ladder one week, I ran into a very interesting mirror. Yes, my opponent had Dondozo, but they also had a vastly different filler core: Chien-pao, Dragonite, and Fluttermane. While I did manage to win the mirror, the encounter still made me think. Switching out our ruinous Pokemon wasn't something that we had toyed with very much, so I gave it a shot. Chien-pao and Dragonite felt incredible with Toxic Spikes and Dondozo, but something just felt off. Fluttermane felt extremely disjointed from the rest of the team, and it always felt like the odd Pterosaur out. So I swapped it out for something that synergized well with our physical attackers, Ting-lu. Ting-lu's extreme bulk and Vessel of Ruin ability is exactly what this offense-oriented team needed. The team felt almost complete, but for whatever reason, we just disregarded it and forgot about it. After rediscovering this core, we did a bit of research to see if anyone else had solved this team before us, and surely enough, we found something very interesting. There was a team in Europe that had the exact same Pokemon as ours, but the Ting-lu wasn't your standard bulky attacker. It had Stealth Rocks. But what place do Stealth Rocks have in VGC? Naturally, we just had to try it. Ting-lu being such a bulky monster meant that we had plenty of opportunities to set up Stealth Rocks, and having chien-pao and Dragonite in the back meant that our opponents could be worn into range of our extreme speeds and sucker punches despite their defensive calcs. Veteran VGC competitor and owner of VGC Corner, Brady Smith even helped us out with an evil suggestion. He suggested that we run Sand Tomb on Ting-lu so that we can synergize with Yawn. With this last piece of wisdom from someone who we knew was going for gold, I felt extremely confident with this team. Glimmora. Glimmora's job is simple. Set up the spikes, spread poison, and get out. Being a relatively weak Pokemon when under the effects of the ever-present Vessel of Ruin meant that it wasn't the hardest hitter, but thanks to its typing and its bulk, we could find chance to spread toxicity easily. We gave Glimmora the Assault Vest item and Terra Grass to help it in the face of super effective moves and the popular Chi-Yu and Iron Bundle core. Ting-lu. Not only does Ting-lu teach astronomy, but they also have the ability to lock down and trap certain annoying threats to the team, such as Amoonguss, Gyarados, and Arcanine. With these fixed damage moves, Ting-lu had maxed out bulk and a spoonful of speed to outspeed Iron Hands and King Gambit. And, of course, who could forget the Stealth Rocks that could swing games in our favor depending on the back matchup. We gave Ting-lu the Citrus Berry for increased longevity, and Terra Poison to completely flip its weaknesses in the face of fighting and fairy moves. Dragonite. Dragonite is a damage monster when equipped with the Choice Band. A neutral Outrage has the chance to knock out even bulky Pokemon, such as Amoonguss, in one hit. To maximize the destructive potential of the Choice Band set, we went with the classic Terra Normal Extreme Speed route, and invested Dragonite fully in attack and speed for maximum offense. Chien-pao. Chien-pao was integral to the fast offensive part of the core. Not only could it dish out massive damage with its strong stab combination, it could help Dragonite or Dondozo do extra damage with its Sword of Ruin ability. With the chip of Poison and Stealth Rocks, Chien-pao could more reliably knock out bulky Fluttermane and opposing Chien-pao in one hit. To make sure that we could capitalize off of Stealth Rocks and priority attacks, we went with the Adamant nature for an extra attack boost, and gave Chien-pao the Focus Sash to help make up for its fragility. Dondozo. Dondozo is by far the member of the team that we spent the most time crafting to perfection. With the blend of anti-Amoonguss tools that we had on this team, including Taunt Ting-lu and Ice Spinner Chien-pao, we felt that we could confidently run the Leftovers item, and run Terra Steel to give us a better matchup against Iron Bundle, Fluttermane, and Clear Smog. Yawn, combined with Sand Tomb, meant that we could trap opponents in and put them to sleep, while Heavy Slam was a free knockout into Fluttermane and other lightweight Pokemon. While we did make ourselves vulnerable to Intimidate by running Unaware, we felt way more confident into opposing boosting Pokemon such as Iron Hands and Annihilate, and both of the good Intimidators would take 25% from Stealth Rocks on the Switch anyway. Tatsugiri. Tatsugiri is mostly here because Dondozo is here, but that doesn't mean that we're going to neglect it. Tatsugiri had the Choice Scarf item, which meant that it could get revenge KOs or help the other members of the team plow through by spreading icy winds. We gave Tatsugiri Terra Steel to flip its weaknesses, and I gave it a spoonful of defense investment to help it survive Adamant Chien-pao Sucker Punch. With my team locked in, my bags packed, and my custom merchandise looking as fly as ever, it was time to go from one meme state to the other, and show North America what KrebsVGC is packing. Okay guys, before we go any further, I need to tell you about VGC Corner, an excellent coaching experience that has agreed to partner with the channel for today's video to help all of you. So stick around to find out what VGC Corner can do for you. I'm going to cut right to the chase and tell you that my experience with VGC Corner has been nothing but excellent, and I mean that sincerely. This service is a huge part of why I felt like I was in competing shape for NAIC. If you're new to VGC, or if you're just looking to improve, you can join an active community that all shares that desire to get better, and that kind of energy is extremely valuable to anyone's competitive journey. VGC Corner offers all the perks of a free VGC server starting out, but if you opt in for the premium version, you get access to cash prize tournaments, weekly Q&A sessions with Brady Smith and other experts, and early access to what the general public sees on Twitter and YouTube. VGC Corner is run by Brady Smith, a multiple-time regional champion and world's top cut performer, so he knows what he's talking about, and his priority is helping you. That's why he's offering you, the viewers of KrebsVGC, a special offer. If you register for the paid version using coupon code KrebsVGC, you get 20% off of your first month, no matter which package you choose. If you're serious about wanting to improve at VGC, I can't recommend VGC Corner enough. So check out VGCcorner.com and remember to use coupon code KrebsVGC if you opt in for the premium pass. I hope to see you there. And now, back to the video. After 2 short and smooth flights and a sandwich with my roommate,
Are you recording me?
I headed to the venue with a couple of my friends from school to pick up my pass and the loads of free stuff that they give to the competitors. The shops were stacked, and the energy in the convention hall was absolutely electric. After meeting up with Smeargle TCG in line, Scott and I headed back to his place for the night so we could get our things in order for the next morning. It was at this point that the nerves really started to set in. This being my first event, I didn't know too much about what to expect, but fortunately, I had the support of my family, friends, the VGC Corner, and Scott. I woke up at 6 AM and headed out to the venue with Scott, equipped with 3 protein bars, my purple wired controller, and a Sharpie marker to have cool people sign my shirt. I was ready to play. I met up with Lim at the venue, and while the line was long, they kept it moving fast. Before I knew, we were already in the venue, and the show was about to start. By 9:15 AM, the pairings were posted, and it was time to put on my game face. Would I meet my goal of going positive? Would I make day 2? Or would I just go 0-9? The time to find out was now. My opponent and I exchanged team sheets, and it's a pretty straightforward matchup. My opponent has a team of Arcanine, Iron Bundle, chien-pao, Fluttermane, Dragonite, and Kingambit. This team resembles the balanced stuff that I was prepared for, but with the inclusion of chien-pao and Dragonite. Game 1 starts and I lead ting-lu and Glomora, while my opponent leads Arcanine and Fluttermane. In this position, I'm able to terastallize my ting-lu into a poison type and reduce incoming damage. And while ting-lu does get burned, I set up my Stealth Rocks and I use Mortal Spin at the same time, while taking minimal damage in return. The clock on my opponent is officially ticking. I'm able to take down the Fluttermane thanks to ting-lu's Sand Tomb, and despite my opponent's defensive play, they are unable to avoid being cleaned up by chien-pao and Dragonite thanks to the Stealth Rocks and the poison, and I'm able to take the first game after a bit of back and forth damage. I might have won game 1, but there was no room to celebrate just yet. Game 2 starts and my opponent has already made an adaptation and leads Kingambit and chien-pao into my ting-lu and Dondozo. My opponent gets aggressive immediately, doubling into my Dondozo, but Dondozo is able to survive and yawns the Kingambit while ting-lu uses Sand Tomb, and the trap is set. My opponent expects me to protect Dondozo and doubles into my ting-lu, but I survive the double up and I easily get the same yawn trap onto chien-pao. My position looks amazing with the sleeping Kingambit and a soon-to-be sleeping chien-pao, but my opponent attacks my ting-lu, which can't protect, removing the Sand Tomb by knocking it out while Dondozo gets more damage down. My position might have looked good before, but I was unable to get up Stealth Rocks that turn, and I wasn't confident that I could KO the Fluttermane in one hit. This lack of confidence gets the best of me, I lose my footing, and I eventually lose the game. I go into game 3 feeling nervous. I really don't want to lose my first set of the day, but for now, let's focus on finishing the set. Seeing that Kingambit did basically nothing for my opponent, I feel confident leading Glomora and ting-lu for the final game of the set. But my opponent shocked me and actually leads Kingambit and chien-pao again. I terastallize my ting-lu immediately, but my opponent calls this and doubles up on Glomora. Thankfully, Glomora survives on low HP and I narrowly dodge losing a Pokemon for free. I use Sand Tomb and Mortal Spin, putting both of my opponents on timers, and the Toxic Spikes are set up for free thanks to my opponent's attacks. I still have a chance. Glomora gets knocked out and ting-lu takes minimal damage, but I miss a crucial Sand Tomb on my opponent's Kingambit, so my opponent essentially got a free turn, and I fall even further behind. Unfortunately, my opponent is able to ignore ting-lu and wear down my Dragonite and chien-pao, and set themselves up to win with their own Dragonite in the endgame. I have lost my first ever official tournament set. My opponent and I shake hands, and they tell me they feel lucky they were able to beat me. He was super nice and actually went undefeated for most of the day. Despite this, I still can't shake the feeling of the snowball effect that this will have on my day. Because of the format of the tournaments, you get paired up with people who have the same record as you, which means the more you lose, the more likely you are to get paired up against off-the-wall teams, and the more you lose to those, the worse your problem gets. Of course, this is a worst case scenario, and not everyone who loses round 1 is running goofy, wacky teams. My next opponent, however, has an extremely interesting team of Garchomp, chien-pao, Goldengo, Talonflame, Iron Moth, and Tinkaton. I'm more than ready for the Hyper Offense core, but Iron Moth and Tinkaton were not a part of my practice at all. Nevertheless, I feel like the matchup is in my favor, and we start the set. I kick off round 2 by leading Ting-lu and Dondozo while my opponent leads Tinkaton and Goldengo. I want to get my Yawn Sand Tomb trap off on Tinkaton, and fortunately my opponent lets me get it off, while Goldengo tricks Choice Specs onto Ting-lu, and Tinkaton uses Play Rough for about 30% on Ting-lu. My opponent switches out, and I'm forced to use Sand Tomb on the incoming chien-pao, while I use Wave Crash on Tinkaton. My opponent would ordinarily be ready to step on the gas, but with their board state sleeping and trapped, and taking massive amounts of chip, they're unable to outdamage my chien-pao, and by the time they finally get rid of my Ting-lu, I'm able to take a convincing win. I lead the same bulky monsters as before, while my opponent shows off an entirely different mode of their team with Garchomp and Talonflame. Since my team is slow, I don't particularly mind my opponent getting up Tailwind, so I opt to go on the offensive. I use Wave Crash on Talonflame, but thanks to Will-O-Wisp, it doesn't KO. Garchomp saves itself from taking a Sand Tomb by protecting itself. I know my opponent doesn't want to get Yawn trapped again, so I protect myself against the opposing Talonflame's taunt, and I'm able to set up Stealth Rocks in return. On the next turn, I KO Talonflame with Wave Crash, and I use Ruination on Garchomp to soften it up for Dragonite. Tinkaton comes in for my opponent, but I switch my Dondozo into Dragonite, dodging a Stopping Tantrum and soaking up a Fake Out on my Ting-lu. The stage is set, and I KO my opponent's Garchomp with a Terra Normal E-Speed, while Ting-lu does damage to my opponent's Tinkaton with Sand Tomb. My opponent reveals Iron Moth to be their last Pokemon, but with no way to protect it, I finish it off with E-Speed and I win the set with ease. While it's definitely too early to call how the day is going to go by round 2, this win definitely put the wind back in my sails. Since that round was so quick, I had plenty of time to meet some friends I've met online, and make sure that my roommate wasn't super bored. Feeling re-energized, I was ready for the next round. My opponent hands me their team sheet for round 3, and my heart sinks. I have to play against my least favorite archetype, Sun. My opponent's Pokemon are Chien-Pao, Torkoal, Great Tusk, Bronzong, Fluttermane, and Roaring Moon. Yikes. I need to play really smart if I don't want my opponent to walk all over me. Game 1 starts with my Ting-lu and Dondozo staring down my opponent's Great Tusk and Roaring Moon. I don't feel confident at all leaving my Ting-lu in for a 50-50 on super effective damage, so I switch it out for Dragonite and get a Yawn on my opponent's Roaring Moon. My opponent switches out Roaring Moon while I get a free Outrage, knocking out Great Tusk in one hit. By this point, my opponent has Chien-Pao and Fluttermane in, and there is very little I can do against this duo with my Dragonite and Dozo at low HP. Despite a decent first couple of turns, I completely lose my momentum against these two fast attackers, and the game is lost. I change things up for game 2, leading with Glimmora and Ting-lu into my opponent's lead of Great Tusk and Bronzong. I wasn't completely sold on having a ground-weak Pokemon in, so I Terastallized my Glimmora into a Grass type, but my opponent Terastallizes their Great Tusk into a Steel type, resisting my Energy Ball, and Bronzong sets up an Iron defense. I trust my Ting-lu to be able to survive the turn, so I leave it in to continue doing valuable chip damage. Great Tusk uses Earthquake, while I use the super effective Earth Power on Great Tusk, knocking it out. My opponent uses Body Press on Ting-lu, but it's able to survive. My opponent sends in their Fluttermane and switches Bronzong into Torkoal, resulting in 2 knockouts, but my combination of Chien-Pao, Dragonite, and Glimmora's Toxic Spikes proved to be too much for Fluttermane, and the Torkoal and Bronzong as well. I win game 2. Realizing that Bronzong didn't work out, my opponent opts to lead Chien-Pao and Great Tusk, but I switch it up as well, leading Chien-Pao and Dragonite, a combination of Pokemon normally reserved for the back. By this point in the set, my notes are sloppy, but I do still remember the first few turns. My opponent commits to Terastallizing Great Tusk once again, but I know that they're too scared to let their Chien-Pao take damage. I capitalize on this and double into the Great Tusk with a Terra Normal E-Speed and Sacred Sword, knocking it out immediately. Despite how well this turn went, committing my Terra and locking into a normal type move puts me in a weird spot, even though I knew in my mind that I needed maximum damage in case my opponent didn't Terastallize into a Steel type. The other downside is that my opponent is now able to bring in their Fluttermane, and their Chien-Pao is actually faster than mine. The speed difference is all it takes to sink me, and I lose game 3 despite such a good first turn. While I did win the battle in the first turn or two, I definitely lost the war because I exposed such a valuable resource on turn 1. Part of this is because the only Sun team that I committed lines into was Jumpluff Sun with a Jetpack Torkoal. But this team felt like an entirely different beast with almost no room for me to weave in my usual tricks. Feeling re-energized by the power of an Italian sub, I sat down for my round 4 ready to ruin someone's day 2 dreams. My opponent had the most peculiar team that I'd seen up until this point. Abomasnow, Iron Bundle, Garchomp, Murkrow, Iron Hands, and Fluttermane. This team looked like a handful of disjointed pairs, but this doesn't mean that I can underestimate my opponent's ability to play it. I want to see which of the 3 modes that my opponent is going to lean into, so I keep it safe with ting-lu and Glomora, and my opponent reveals that they would like to use the Snow, leading Abomasnow and Garchomp. Thanks to my practice, I know that people don't like taking tons of damage on their Life Orb Garchomp in the early game, so I read Garchomp to protect, and I successfully get a Sand Tomb and Power Gem onto Abomasnow, bringing it low. Turn 2 is looking good. I Terrasilize Glomora knowing that my opponent wants to use a ground type move, and I use Mortal Spin and go for Sand Tomb. But I miss Sand Tomb on the Garchomp, and to add insult to injury, my opponent freezes my poor Glomora with Blizzard. Because of this, the game is essentially a 1v2, and while I do make all the right calls I need with my Glomora, even going as far to call on a switch, my frozen Glomora remains unable to attack, and I lose the game due to this unfortunate circumstance. I need to make sure that I don't end up in the position where I'm vulnerable to getting frozen like that, so for game 2 I lead my iconic duo of Dondozo and ting-lu, with the goal of creating a 1v2 of my own. My opponent switches Garchomp into Abomasnow and launches a 100% accurate Blizzard onto my side of the field. Thanks to ting-lu, the damage is minimal, and I get my Yawn Sand Tomb combo onto the Iron Bundle. Not wanting to take 2 Blizzards, I Terrasilize my ting-lu and protect Dondozo. My opponent sets up the Aurora Veil, and Bundle does a tiny amount of chip damage while I do massive damage with Ruination on Abomasnow. I take advantage of the now sleeping Iron Bundle and I swap ting-lu to chien-pao. Abomasnow uses Blizzard, doing a small amount of damage to both my Pokemon, but freezing my Dondozo. On the next turn, I knock out my opponent's Iron Bundle with Sacred Sword, while Abomasnow grabs a free KO on my frozen Dondozo. It's a 1-for-1 trade, but I feel like it's much more in my favor. I bring in my Dragonite to match my opponent's Garchomp, and I have an important call to make. Does my opponent Terrasilize their Garchomp? I decide that the answer is yes, and I lock in Sacred Sword and Outrage. Surely enough, my opponent Terrasilizes their Garchomp into a Steel type, and I take a knockout because of chien-pao. As a follow-up, my Dragonite lands a critical hit on Abomasnow, ignoring the Aurora Veil. My opponent brings in Murkrow, but there's nothing that bird can do to beat my powerful attackers, and I tie the set 1-1. I decide that for the next game, I need to drastically switch it up, as I've been pretty lucky with my calls so far. I lead with the powerful duo of chien-pao and Dragonite against my opponent's Snow lead of Iron Bundle and Abomasnow. My opponent senses danger and switches Iron Bundle in for Focus Sash Murkrow while setting up the Aurora Veil. However, I get aggressive and I Terrasilize my Dragonite into a normal type immediately, knocking out Murkrow with a double up. My opponent brings Iron Bundle back in, but there's very little it can do to my normal type and Ice type Pokemon. It uses Icy Wind, but I get a KO in return with a double up from Extreme Speed and Sacred Sword. My opponent's final Pokemon is Garchomp, but I predict my opponent to protect, and I get another double up on Abomasnow, netting my 3rd free KO of the game, and pulling myself so far ahead that my opponent forfeits. To say the least, Dragonite ate its Wheaties today, and I was definitely lucky that it targeted the right slots in some of those games. But I also feel like my opponent should have tried to capitalize off of their cleared speed advantage while they had the chance, instead of playing so defensively. The next 3 sets are all against very similar balance teams, so I'll just make this quick. My round 5 opponent had a standard New Balance, but with one important change: Dragon Dance Gyarados. And paired with the support of Iron Hands, Amoonguss, and Iron Bundle, there was very little I could do to stop it from bulldozing my entire team. I'm now 2-3. My round 6 opponent also had a pretty standard balance team, but with no fancy techs at all, and I take a convincing 2-0 with smart plays and the power of Big Stall. I'm now 3-3. My round 7 opponent had another standard balance team, but with something no other balance team I'd encountered had: Mental Herb Amoonguss. Unfortunately for me, my only way to stop Amoonguss was Taunt. Despite this, I win game 1, but my opponent adapts during game 2, and I get super unlucky game 3 by missing 2 Sand Tombs and I get multiple 3-turn sleeps. I lose game 3 and I'm now 3-4. While most people would have dropped after going 2-3, I am not most people. I wasn't here to get my Worlds invite, I was here to just play Pokemon and set a new personal best for my future performances. Despite my low bar to just go positive, I was really starting to feel some of those close losses. I'd never gone this hard in a series of Pokemon games before, and I was starting to feel the mental strain, and it was definitely showing in my sets. That being said, my goal to go positive was still alive, so I marched to my table for round 8 and prepared to face my next challenge. I could feel my mental state physically get worse when I saw that my opponent had Screamtail, a very quick and very annoying support Pokemon on their team. The rest of the team was Arcanine, Dragonite, Iron Bundle, Fluttermane, and Kingambit. The team was a little different than what I was used to, but of course, as a Dondozo user, I had practiced up and down what to do against Screamtail. Game 1 starts with my chien-pao and Glomora against my opponent's Fluttermane and Iron Bundle. My opponent has Terra Ghost on Iron Bundle, and I correctly call that they will Terrastalize it. I don't fall into the trap of using Sacred Sword, but I definitely should have targeted it with Sucker Punch. But my Sucker Punch instead went into Flutter Mane. My opponent KOs my chien-pao with their 2 special attackers, and Glomora uses Mortal Spin. I felt really bad about that turn and how non-committal my play was, but I try not to slow down too much. I send in Dondozo and I Terrastalize it into a Steel type. My opponent is thrown off by doing this, doing almost no damage with Freeze Dry, while my Glomora KOs Flutter Mane, and Dondozo uses Heavy Slam on Iron Bundle. My opponent sends in Arcanine, which does way too much damage to my Terra Steel Dondozo with Flare Blitz, and Iron Bundle finally finishes off my Glomora. Unfortunately for me, I had Tatsugiri in the back and my Dondozo was no longer in fighting shape. Because of the forced 1v2 after Glomora is knocked out, I'm completely out of position and I lose the game. I'm practically fighting against my own head at this point, but I need to press on and try to bring back this set. I lead Glomora and ting-lu while my opponent keeps their lead from game 1. I Terrastalize my ting-lu into a poison type to avoid super effective damage, but my opponent sees through this and doubles up on Glomora. Miraculously, Glomora survives the combination, but in return, it misses the KO on Iron Bundle by 1 HP. On the following turn, Glomora is knocked out, and I weave in Stealth Rocks with ting-lu. I feel like I can bring this game back because of my chien-pao's Focus Sash, my chip damage, and my opponent's fragility. I bring in chien-pao in place of my fallen Glomora, and I hit Protect in the face of Icy Wind and Dazzling Gleam. But my ting-lu is unable to take advantage of this opening when it misses a crucial Sand Tomb against my opponent's Flutter Mane. Without this chip damage, my chien-pao is a sitting duck for another double up, and I can't KO with Sucker Punch. I end up losing my chien-pao without doing enough damage, and all I can do is watch as my opponent uses Scream Tail to shut down my endgame and take the set. I have never felt worse about playing a set of VGC in my entire life, and I don't feel like I can go any further. My play felt sloppy, and my mistakes were screaming at me as soon as I would make a play. But there was only one more round, my goal of going positive might be shot, but the least I can do is try to win this final set. After all, my opponent and I are both 3-5. What do I have to lose? My opponent and I trade team sheets and I realize just how much is at stake. My mental health. Remember when I said that Sun was my nightmare matchup? Yeah, forget that. The thing I saw on the team that drained the life from my eyes was none other than Orthworm, a Pokemon seemingly built to perfectly counter my team. With Orthworm's sky-high defense, decent speed, and broken ability, I was going to have an extremely tough time breaking it, especially when combined with the support of the other members of the team. But hey, I'm already at the table, there's no point in quitting now. Game 1 starts and my opponent has an incredible lead in Gyarados and Orthworm. I lead Dondozo and ting-lu, my bread and butter, but I realize too late that my lead basically can't do anything to Orthworm, and what I can do to Gyarados is very limited. My opponent uses Taunt on Dondozo, blocking my Yawn that I targeted into the Orthworm. In return, my ting-lu uses Taunt on Orthworm, but takes massive damage from Body Press, while doing nothing in return. I Terrastalize my ting-lu to avoid taking too much damage from Body Press, and my opponent uses Bulldoze on Gyarados to slow me down and get valuable chip damage. Predicting another Bulldoze and Body Press, I switch my Dondozo into Dragonite, and I get the call right. My Dragonite comes in basically for free while I use Ruination on Gyarados. On the following turn, Dragonite outspeeds Gyarados and takes the KO with Outrage, but this means that Orthworm is free to use Shed Tail, and passes a substitute to Flutter Mane. With their Flutter Mane having a substitute and my Pokemon being slow and worn down, it should be no surprise that I lose Game 1. Before setting up for Game 2, I stopped and took a deep breath. I really didn't want to lose my last set of the day, so I thought of every possible game plan that I could bring to counter my opponent's super tough lead. Then, it hits me. I decide to use a secret strategy that I haven't used all day, and I change my in-game music from Top Champion to Nemona 2. Little did my opponent know, but I'm very easily influenced by music, and the high energy battle theme revitalized me and filled me with hope. I start off with a completely different lead, dropping my defensive backbone and leading with fully offensive Dragonite and chien-pao into my opponent's returning Gyarados and Orthworm. I notice that my opponent has Terra Ghost on Orthworm, and I avoid the trap of using Sacred Sword by double targeting the Gyarados, while Dragonite's Outrage slams Orthworm for over half of its health. I wish I had doubled it with Sucker Punch and Outrage, but because of Intimidate and the Citrus Berry, it's very unlikely this would have KO'd the Orthworm. My opponent uses Bulldoze and Body Press onto chien-pao, taking my Ruinous Cat in one turn. I'm down for the time being, but I'm far from being out. I bring in Tatsugiri, recognizing that my opponent's weakness is that they have no answer for strong special attackers. I use Muddy Water, hitting both targets for decent damage and dropping both of their accuracy. There's little my opponent can do in return thanks to the accuracy drops and the type matchups. I'm able to make the same play the next turn for double KO. My opponent brings in their final two Pokemon, Iron Hands and chien-pao. I read the field and decide it's time to go full Dozo mode. I switch out my Dragonite for Dondozo, which swallows Tatsugiri. My opponent uses Haze with chien-pao. Wait, Haze? It turns out that my dread of seeing Earthworm caused me to completely neglect the chien-pao, and I didn't notice that they were running Haze over Sucker Punch. Regardless, I get my yawn on chien-pao, and Dondozo is able to tank the incoming Thunder Punch. On the following turn, I use Protect to stall the turn, and chien-pao falls asleep. With chien-pao asleep, I can use Wave Crash to bring it down nice and low before Iron Hands knocks me out with Thunder Punch. But this is all a part of my plan. I bring Dragonite back in to pair it with Tatsugiri, and the game is locked up. My opponent tries to attack, but chien-pao stays asleep, and I take both of my opponent's final Pokemon with the combination of Muddy Water and Outrage. I might have won game 2, but my opponent now knows my tricks, so I'll have to change it up again. With Nemona 2 still playing, I send out Glimmora and chien-pao, leaving my Dragonite behind because I expect them to adapt, but my opponent just leads Gyarados and Earthworm again. Okay. Knowing that my opponent is wiser than to Terrasilize Earthworm again, I use Sacred Sword on it, but it does basically no damage. Okay, not a good start. I use my Terra Grass Glimmora to use Power Gem on Gyarados, while my opponent uses Bulldoze and Body Press to knock out my chien-pao. This is a lot like game 2, except I am in a much more precarious position in terms of the damage traded. I bring my Dondozo in place of chien-pao and decide it's time to pull the trigger early. I swap out my Glimmora for Tatsugiri and lock in Wave Crash to knock out Gyarados. For some reason, my opponent uses Iron Defense on Earthworm, possibly being unaware of unaware. My opponent sends in chien-pao, and just like before, it uses Haze to erase my stat boosts. I knew this would happen, but I knew that the turn would still be in my favor, and I use Wave Crash, doing massive damage to chien-pao despite not having any stat boosts. Chien-pao chips at my Dondozo while I use Wave Crash against Earthworm, doing a solid amount of damage thanks to the Sword of Ruin. In this position, the Earthworm can barely do anything except use Body Press for minimal damage. I know it's only a matter of time before my opponent recognizes this and uses Shed Tail. My opponent goes for Sacred Sword once more, but Dondozo protects to stall out the poison damage. Unfortunately, my opponent now has a free Shed Tail and passes a substitute to Iron Hands. My Dondozo, even without the speed boost, is faster than my opponent's Iron Hands, and I'm able to knock out the low HP Earthworm when it comes back in, creating a 1v3. My opponent capitalizes on the substitute, and Iron Hands uses Swords Dance, while it still has its protection. However, even behind the substitute, it still takes poison damage. I break my opponent's substitute with Wave Crash, but Iron Hands retaliates with a Thunder Punch. Dondozo, who's been such a trooper all day, goes down for the final time. It's Tatsugiri's chance to take center stage. I bring in Glimmora and I launch a combination of Power Gem and Draco Meteor, doing massive damage to Iron Hands, but it just barely survives and KOs Glimmora with Drain Punch. This game, which has gone on for so long, all comes down to an accuracy check. I lock in my move and put my hands up. Tatsugiri uses Draco Meteor, and it hits! Tatsugiri takes the KO and wins me my final set of Regulation C 2-1. My friends all found me and asked how I felt about my record, and despite not meeting my goal, I was just happy to have won that last set and finished the day on a positive note. Scott, Lim, Smeargle, and I all left the venue and got some food together, and that was just amazing. If I come back to compete again, if for nothing else, it will be for the post-Day 1 celebration. While I didn't get to play on Day 2, I went to watch the Unite Finals with Scott, who had been watching the day prior. It was really cool seeing TTV take the whole thing after a clean bracket reset. The following day was Finals Day, but I had a plane to catch. Scott dropped me off at the airport and I said goodbye to him until I get to see him back at school. I don't think I could have had a better host, and the people I was with at this event are the reason it will be memorable to me for a very long time. On the ride back, I reflected on my experience, on the plays I should have made, the changes I could have made to the team, and overall what I could have done better. I think with these notes and my new experience, I'll be able to come back next year and make an even better showing for myself. But until then, this has been my North America International Championships experience, and I will see you next time. Don't forget to use code KrebsVGC for 20% off. Okay, bye!